in terms of a problem, but what problems are police better suited to respond to? So I like to use the language of detasking police, getting away from all the political nuances in terms of defunding. Detasking does not necessarily mean defunding, but it means taking away tasks that police are not trained for, not qualified to respond to, and putting them in the hands of individuals that are better trained. So many of the police officers that I've spoken to say, listen, we prefer not to respond to issues around mental health. We are not trained to deal with mental health. We prefer to not respond to issues around homelessness. We are not trained to do that. So those sort of tasks, could you put it in the hands of community workers, social workers, individuals who are better trained to respond to issues of domestic violence, along with some sort of community safety officer in the situations around substance abuse, homelessness, truancy? I mean, it would seem reasonable to detask the police and have better qualified individuals who have the technical knowledge, the socio-behavioral knowledge to respond to these types of problems. So I think when we talk about responding to problems, we have to tease out what particular problems we are talking about.
When Dexter talks about, Dexter describes it as detasking, Barry Friedman describes it as disaggregating the police function. And one of the things that he notes in this incredible paper that came out earlier this year is that there's very little the police actually do that it relates to crime fighting. And that's not, their fault. Much of what they get called to do has very little to do with crime. And so in relatively safe communities, maybe about 2%, 3% of what they do is related to crime. In neighborhoods that are, or cities that are high crime, you're probably upwards more around 10% or so. So for instance, one study found that in Baltimore, a very high crime city, about 11% of the police activity was related to crime fighting, and about half of that was related to violent crime. And so if police are by and large doing things like responding to traffic accidents and those kinds of things, one could easily imagine other folks without guns taking on those tasks, folks who, as Dexter points out, might be better prepared, maybe better trained to do those things so that police can focus on other things that they have been trained to do. And so I think if we take seriously this fact that a lot of what the police are being asked to do has very little to do with crime, it actually, I think it should alleviate us in some ways, because we're not losing, most communities aren't losing that much. We could have other kinds of services replace the police in terms of what they're doing. I don't need the police to come in when I get into a traffic accident. I don't need the police to come and help me get my cat out of the tree. I don't need the police to come for those kinds of things. And then they can focus their attention on other kinds of tasks, as Dexter called it. So I think we should really take that seriously. We wouldn't be losing much by removing them from some of the things that we have them doing. And then there are a whole host of more serious situations that we would also want more trained specialists to be involved in. Here I'm thinking of the CAHOOTS organization in Eugene, Oregon. They are the primary responders to mental health crises in Eugene. They deal with substance abuse issues, conflict resolution issues, the list goes on and on. I think it was last year, they responded to 24,000 calls. Of those 24,000 calls, only 250 required the presence of police. It's much cheaper, much more effective, because they're bringing trained specialists on the ground to deal with the variety of issues that police tend to deal with. And they do so much more effectively, and they do so much cheaper. You can imagine then using those resources that would otherwise go to police to support institutions, especially those in struggling communities. So I think that there are ways that we can think about this. We could reduce our reliance on police significantly.
I'm going to make a quick plug here. One of my fabulous colleagues, Christy Thompson, did a really great piece on the CAHOOTS program at the Marshall Project that I encourage you to check out if you're interested in learning more about it. So this idea of detasking, unbundling, disaggregating police function has really emerged as a consensus opinion this year on a lot of levels, right? There's many folks in law enforcement who I've spoken to are open to and excited about this idea. A lot of sort of traditional liberal voices like this idea, and even many activist voices who would trend towards abolition are open to or like this idea. So I guess I wonder, could we run down some of the places where we could all imagine police function being replaced either by civil servants or potentially by technological innovations?
So while we talk about this, I just want to throw out a factoid that I think many people on the call would know, that the United States is the most heavily armed country in the Western world, right? So we have almost 320 million guns in the United States. So when we are talking about civilians responding, I think we also have to keep in mind that we have a heavily armed populace. So I'm not shooting myself in the foot here in terms of going against some of what I've said, but I want to put that really important weighty context into the conversation.
I actually would follow up with that too. I think it's dangerous to think that we could limit policing to fighting crime. There are times when we need to stop someone from doing something they're doing, or require them to do something that they don't want to do, or punish. It's the punishing them for breaking the rules that might be crime oriented. But sometimes we need to intervene in disputes that aren't criminal and still need to be taken care of by someone who can use force if necessary. And while I agree entirely that we can retask many activities to civilians, to specialists, we can turn over some tasks like traffic patrol to technological solutions that may also reduce bias. So I think we should push hard on those options, but we should also recognize that there are times when we're going to need law enforcement, even when a serious crime is not at issue.
But that's where I think that the CAHOOTS model comes back into play. It wasn't that police were completely eliminated. There were 250 situations where they were called in because they were needed, but there were 24,000 where they weren't. And so we don't, I think that of that is evidence that we don't need them in at least some great numbers of communities. We do not need their presence in the way that we have relied on them and have come to assume that they're the only responses that would be reasonable. I think the CAHOOTS model is a great one to the extent that it shows if you bring in people who are skilled, so they have a medic and they also have someone who is able to negotiate in situations where there's high conflict, you can actually resolve problems without creating any harm and without bringing about violence. So to me, a situation, a service that can deal with those really difficult issues that you're describing, because people are trained to do so, I think we should provide space where that can happen and perhaps be ready to call on police when the situation is called for. And I'm assuming that those 250 incidences where they were called for, those were the situations in which it mattered. But to me, it highlights how infrequently they're actually needed for that purpose. So I get what Dexter is saying. I think that, there's no question we're one of the most violent community or countries in the world, and some communities more violent than others. But there are ways that we can approach it with, and I think successfully so, without necessarily bringing in the police, who in some instances, and especially in some communities, actually create more harm than good.